Greetings, folks. Welcome back. In this short video, we're going to talk about elasticity and revenue. We'll start with some basic concepts related to elasticity and a firm's revenue. Of course, we know from the law of demand that if there's an increase in price, there's a decrease in quantity demanded. But the law of demand doesn't really tell us anything about what happens to a firm's revenue when price changes. Let's say price increases by a lot. There's this huge increase in price, but quantity demanded only goes down by a little. So if you have a huge price increase and a really small change in quantity, of course that's consistent with the law of demand, but in this case a firm's revenue will increase. On the other hand, let's say you have a case where a firm increases its price just by a little bit, but quantity demanded decreases by a lot. Again, that's consistent with the law of demand, but in this case, a firm's revenue will decrease. So let's look at a couple of examples here. Here we have an example that should be familiar. We looked in an earlier lecture at what happens when the price changes from $90 to $110. So you have this price increase. You start at 90, you move up to 110. And when that price increases, there's a reduction in quantity demanded from 65 to 35. So we went through the calculations before on this one. We found that the elasticity was equal to 3, which means the demand is elastic. So what we saw here was it was a 20% change in price, but there was 60% change in quantity demanded. So we can say that households were very responsive to that price change. So then what happens to revenue? Well, the initial revenue when price was $90 was $5,850. And then after the price change, again, price went up, but quantity demanded fell by quite a bit because, again, consumers were very responsive. So the revenue went down to $3,850. So again, demand was elastic, so the price increase led to a reduction in a firm's total revenue. So here's another example. In this case, instead of looking at a price increase, we'll look at a price decrease. So let's say the price started at $120 and it went down to $80. At a price of $120, the quantity demanded was 45. And then when the price fell, the quantity demanded went up to 55. So we can go through the calculations. And if we were to do that, we would find that the price elasticity of demand was equal to 0.5. So there was a 40% reduction in price. That's a really large price change, but quantity demanded only went up by 20%. So consumers were not very responsive to that price change. So let's look now at what happened to the firm's revenue. Before the price change, the revenue was $5,400. That was the initial price of $120 times the initial quantity demanded of 45. Then after the price change, remember the price went down by $40 from $120 to $80. The revenue was $4,400. So there was a pretty substantial reduction in price. The quantity only went up by like 20%. So overall revenue went down. So what's the general lesson that we learned from these two examples? We found that if demand is elastic, the change in total revenue, whether it's positive or negative, is the opposite of the price change. So if demand is elastic and the price goes up, total revenue of the firm goes down. On the other hand, if demand is elastic and the price goes down, the total revenue of the firm increases. We also learned that if demand is inelastic, the change in total revenue goes in the same direction as the price change. So we saw this in the second example that we looked at. The price went down, but because demand was inelastic, total revenue went down as well. Had that second example been a price increase with inelastic demand, total revenue would have gone up. So to wrap things up, let's just think about what might happen to the total revenue that a firm generates from different types of goods. So let's say a firm sells luxury goods. If you increase the price of a luxury good, chances are the firm will bring in less revenue. Again, that's because a luxury good has a pretty high elasticity. The demand is elastic, so people respond to that price change. On the other hand, if you were a firm that sold a product with no close substitutes, if you increase the price of that good because the demand is inelastic, you'll increase revenue. So that's it for this lecture on elasticity and revenue, and we'll see you next time.